Okay, I hope you all had a chance to grab a coffee. Feel free to bring them with you. I've brought mine. Our second panel is on the opportunities for using data to manage grids more efficiently, to bring clean energy onto the grid, and specifically the role of the individual in sharing household data to move this forward. And joining me to discuss this, I've got Herczog, who is your title is Data Sommelier at the Research Data Alliance, and you're also a former member of the European Parliament with the MSP in Hungary. We also have Jānis Folkmanis, a policy officer, the senior policy officer, at the European Commission in DG Research and Innovation. And we have Bertrand Deprez, who is the Vice President of EU Government Affairs at Schneider Electric. We're also expecting Roberto Zangrandi, the Secretary General of EDSO for Smart Grids, but he's not here yet. If anyone sees him, please send him my way. So I'm going to just dive straight in with my icebreaker questions. As before, I'd like to keep this as free-flowing a conversation as possible. So I think I'll throw this out to everyone. Why do we need data to bring renewables onto the grid? Jānis, you looked at me first.
Thank you very much. I don't need to do anything. That's excellent. Clearly, I mean, we have made a big effort during the last 15 years, 15 years more or less, to get renewables up to speed. This has been a very, it's been a Europe-led initiative, largely, globally, and I think we really should be proud of that. Of course, the upside is clearly in cost, finally. We're already seeing that in sectors like wind. And the upside is in the cost area of operations. Yeah, once you've got your capital, everybody knows this. Once you've got your capital investments done, your operations should be much cheaper, and it's very flexible. We see that on rooftops. Yeah? That's the subject of today, in fact. And so the effort to bring renewables up to speed, we've really got it kicked off. Whether we'll get where we want to in the 2050 timescale is a completely different question, but we really have achieved a lot already. Of course, the downside, as we all know, is intermittency. I mean, renewables give their energy when they want, not when we want. And so really, that needs a different style of management. It needs a different style of management in the overall grid. It needs a different style of management as soon as you have rooftop PV and other local energy sources in the town. So really, we need new models of managing it, and as soon as you start managing things differently, you have new ideas for business models. And this is really where we are today.
Mm-hmm. And where's the interplay here between so the data that tells us what we're going to need when and where, and the management that enables, and the physical moving back and forth of energy, and the timing that you can't control the timing of when the energy comes out. So how does it interplay with storage technologies, for example? How does this equation look, and what's the weight of data in that equation?
The weight of data is I mean, operational data and predictive data are available. So, for example, in the overall wind park scenario, I'm talking really, the North Sea type of wind park, you do have predictive data, so you can actually start to look at, in the short term, when you have that, when the wind is going to blow, and you can have reasonable weather forecasts also for solar. So you can have some sort of information about when things are going to be actually flowing. Then you need quite a lot of data about what is happening in the electricity flows generated and who is managing what. And then we zero in very, very quickly in this discussion when we're talking about the consumer to the smart meter. Because the smart meter really is, if I'm thinking as a consumer or an aggregator in terms of electricity provision, local electricity provision as a business, my meter is my accounting. And so really it is quite a central and vital tool for me.
Okay, Bertrand, obviously Schneider Electric works on the sort of the hardware and then the nuts and bolts side of this. What are the technical challenges, assuming you have this data of moving the energy where you want it at any given time?
So first, maybe to complement what Jānis was saying, I think it is needed because you are now in a different situation, right? Before it was like a water tap, right? You open your water and you drink. Now it has to be much more decentralized, and hence you have to understand much more, like how people are going to use the energy consumption. And this is what you say about, knowing who and what people are doing in the different assets. So your question is about, like what technology you need. First, we are strong in hardware, but also in software. So I think it depends on the situation. And first, I think one of the first benefits about data and the integration of renewable and like largely speaking about the new energy system is that it's not only about understanding what people are doing, it's also about creating new business model, which is really at the core of, like how you're going to deploy more renewable, because you need to have a clear business case and make sure that it's profitable. So I think that is the first thing. In terms of knowing how and when people consume, well, we speak a lot about smart meter, but there are a lot of sources about how to know what people are doing in real time. So for example, at Schneider, we do the electrical panel in households, but also in large buildings. And within those panels, you have the fuse, right? Which, like you can fuse for kitchen, fuse for, like every type of energy consumption. And here it's very simple. You can connect with a tag, like a product, and follow real time, how much people are consuming. So I think knowing exactly, like how much people consume are not a big issue. And I think the big issue is, like developing the right software capability so that, like again, it's you provide to the utilities or to the end users, like a user-friendly way to kind of interact with your operator. That's the first point. And then aside, as I was saying, it's also about business model. So the technology, I think, is clearly not an issue today, and we have not so expensive tool to really track the energy consumption. And again, the smart meter is a great enabler, right, but there are many other ways to know exactly how people consume, and also to give them their tool to kind of automatize and predict and give them the kind of artificial intelligence that could be used to adjust the type of consumption to how they behave. Okay.
Right. So is this where we get to the link from smart meters to dynamic pricing?
Right.
So this is pricing based on, well, partly on how you use data at different times, but also on how everyone else is using data at different times. When the peaks in demand are. So, I mean, what's the role of dynamic pricing in making smart grids work? And I think this is a question. The second part, I think I'll put to Edith, because this is where politics gets in. Because I don't claim to be an expert on every member state, but I know that in my home country, energy pricing is a really big political issue that people get quite motivated about. How do you get citizens on board with the idea with the idea that their energy pricing is going to change because of this piece of technology in their house?
So
I'm going to let everyone respond to that, because I'm sure you'll all have comments on it.
No, clearly, I think dynamic pricing is super important. No, I think it's how you kind of include the flexibility, within the way you develop your pricing scheme. So, and it's true for end user, but it should also be true for DSOs, right? Because, like right now, a DSO is not being remunerated on the base of the flexibility or the sustainability of its energy, only on the amount. So clearly that's a very important element, but again, it's not only for end user, but it's for all the value chain.
You just pointed out the DSO that's not in the room.
Yes, absolutely, right.
It's a time for me to come in. I'd like to just before answering the dynamic pricing, which in my country actually is a myth. We have the government decided price in Hungary, so actually Hungary is the total exception and probably not the best example for the European internal market for electricity price. But I'd like to come back that why we have to do the renewable. And at this stage, I'd like to say that we have to do it because promise is promise. And the last big, great message what Europe advocated to the European citizens where they bought in, that the renewable and generally the energy revolution is on its way. We can do it without nuclear, we can do it without fossil. This is the promise, yeah? So there is a generation growing in who believes that it has to be done, and this is the way to do. So now you have no other choice if you wish to be kind of reliable political body to say, yes, this is the promise, and the promise is a promise, so this is what we are doing. I think that in the last 20 years, the businesses developed the business models, so actually invested a lot to make this happen. So to turn back, I think it would be very wrong and very bad in the same time. Yeah? So it would be both wrong politically and would be very bad economically and business-wise for Europe. Why data? Why data is important for the energy sector? I think that first, data is important for all the sectors, and someone would need to answer the question that why it would not be true for the energy. Yeah? So actually, it will happen for everything, including the energy, and I have many reasons why the energy should be quite the first one. And one argument which I'd like to use in terms of energy, that data is actually, and the data industry is a very real-time business. And in that sense, is extremely similar to electricity because electricity is a very real-time business. Yeah, you have to get as many you use in the same very moment. Yeah, so especially without the storage capacities for Europe, it was the most real-time business. So actually, the data industries can also learn and benefit from the electricity business because electricity has centuries of experience to be in the real time, and data is the real time by sui generis. Yeah. So the pricing and the smart meter. I was in the European Parliament from 2004 to 2014, and by the way, now I'm sitting in the Acer Management Board, the Energy Regulators Management Board in Ljubljana, and I have to say that this is a very sad story. You know when I have heard the smart meters first? Actually, it was used by me when I arrived to the European Parliament in 2004, with a totally different meaning in that days, because we didn't have the data industry in those days. Yeah? So smart meter meant something totally different than today. And in 2007, we put it to the legislation, and today we have 2018, isn't? All right, so can I make one trial here, 1 minute trial? May I ask you that who is among yourself checked the measurement, what you have at home today? How many of you checked your meter for electricity today? Nobody? Yesterday? Last week? Last month? Last week? Okay, 2. Last month? 3. You had a special reason or you do it regularly? Yeah. So actually, this is where we are. Yeah. And my fight, and this is just to finish in that lot, my fight for the smart meter was, in those days, before the smart meter and the data was established, to remove the meters at the households to the visible place into the kitchen with the digital numbering to show that if I open the fridge, then it's moving faster, and if I don't use any electricity, then nothing happens. And the meters are still in the cellar in most of the places, in the dark room where you actually do not wish to see it because they are ugly. So neither the designers, neither the smart meter producers, neither anyone was interested to developing the smart meters to put as a beauty into the most visible place of the household. The last say on this, that we are very keen to pay our telephone bill by knowing exactly with whom how many minutes we talked. Yeah, which actually is far more easy to remember than your electricity usage. So my question that why we should not have the absolutely similar concept-based invoices for electricity? Why not? Yeah, so the smart households are still on their way, and the smart households are very different from the smart metering for electric grids. Back to the electric grids, I think that the electric grids, smartification and digitization will be one of the key enabling technology to make the renewable and any kind of fluctuating capacity use, not only for renewable in my view, together with the battery. So I keep the smartification of the grid in the same box in my mind that I keep the storage and the battery facilities at this stage. Yeah, thank you. Sorry I was a bit long, but
No, that was good.
I'm a woman.
I mean, I think that the more people have to say, the more everyone else has to respond to. I want to stay on the smart meters because besides the challenge of you're getting people on board with the idea of dynamic pricing, and then you make a good point when you refer to the comparison with telephones, where we just accept this as normal. There has been pushback against smart meters, not on pricing grounds, but on privacy grounds. This concern that, this idea that higher frequency, by higher frequency I mean the meters collecting more snapshots of the data that's being consumed more frequently. That this reveals more information about a household. And of course, that's the entire point, because that's how you manage the grid. I think how should, I'm trying not to use the word we, how should the businesses working on this and how should policymakers respond to those types of anxieties? And I'd ask you in particular to think about what I said at the beginning with I don't know if you were here for my opening speech, but that we have a responsibility to make smart grids work if we want to get off fossil fuels. How do we get citizens involved in this idea, and how do we respond to concerns about privacy in sharing smart meter data?
Well, I mean, just maybe to address the point about smart meter, I think in the very similar way as it's not the data which is important when you buy a smartphone, right? It's a smartphone. That's the same about smart meter, right? So when it comes to the mass market, the mass customers market, you need to find something which is attractive enough for people to buy it, right? Mm-hmm. And to be fair, I think the smart meter is, again, a good enabler, is a good gateway to get into the smart world. But I think today many of the products are not delivering enough services and new product for the mass market to be, sexy enough, right? So that's my first point. So I think, and that's why I started to say, right, it's super important to have business model which, is attractive enough, right? So, and this is, I think, the limit that the smart meter market is reaching today. And again, there are a lot of alternatives, to get the data and to develop new services. I mentioned, using the electrical panel, which is in the world, what Google has been doing with their Nest. And there are a lot today of companies developing energy management box, which in a way delivers a kind of services and products which are more attractive to customers. My second point is you need to make a distinction between, let's say, the tertiary building and the, let's say, B2B world and the, mass market world, where when you take a building like that, the data itself has a lot of value, right? So enough, that to build new services without to have to think about super sexy product. And this is where also complexity come when it comes to, what your question about data privacy, because again, you have to make the distinction between residential market where it's mainly about data privacy and, the other big energy users like this building, like industry, where it's mostly about non-personal data, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the first distinction you have to make. When it comes to residential market, right, you have to take, the GDPR into account, right? And in the end of the day, whether you want it or not, I think you have to kind of go into the direction of, the privacy by design concept, right? You have to develop your product based on this principle. When it comes to, the other big energy users, like again, tertiary buildings, industries, that's a different story. And so the big question mark is, where is the limit of the data protection regulation? Does it cover only like personal data, or would it also cover some, or like both personal and non-personal data? Which is
where your privacy comes in as well.
Absolutely, you see what I mean by that, right? This is where privacy comes, and here, in terms of policy discussion, we are not there yet, but I think there are other issues like portability, which like is a question which is coming, and that we have to address. But I think first, again, when it comes to the residential markets linked to smart meter, yeah, I mean you have to comply and you have to develop your product based on the principle of privacy by design I just mentioned, right?
Yes, I'd like to share you something on this which gave me a lot of thinking. Yeah, that I know the SME who produced the smart meters for water production, the water measurement. And the company, because that time the legislation didn't allow it in Europe, went to make its business in the Middle East. Yeah, so the water consumption is a very non-personalized data. I mean, water is a very non-sensitive data, you would think. Yeah, but then the guy, the managing director of this SME, showed me all the consumption in one big block house in Libya, in this case, and you could see the water consumption. And then he said, yeah, but can you imagine that we can exactly say from this water usage who is religious in that block? Because those who are religious wash their hands before they are praying, and you can exactly know when is the praying time, and therefore you can identify those people who wash their hands exactly at 11 o'clock and 5 o'clock, or so exactly in the praying time. And therefore, just from the water consumption, you have the clear picture that in which house, how many people are religious. And you would definitely agree that to know about the water consumption is not a big deal. It's actually about to improve efficiency, and it's a very important issue, of course, in the Middle East. But what is about your religion? So when you give your consent, what you gave your consent on? Most of the people would never think that you can find out from your water consumption which religions you have. And it's only one example. The issue with this that I think it's a very concrete example, but also shows that how many unintended things could happen, which you cannot give your consent in front head. Yeah? Therefore, I think it's a very difficult and very slippery surface. Maybe I have another question to tell that, by the way, I don't think that the privacy is the biggest issue regarding the smart meters. Yeah? So let's discuss the privacy, but I think it's important, but not the most important at the moment for the smart grid development. Yes?
No, I think that was the kind of the basis of my question was how do we get that message to people who are concerned about privacy? Jānis?
Yeah. You asked the question, so what does the regulator do? Regulation in this area is a difficult balancing act, but I think colleagues in DG Energy really are doing a very good job. If you read the package from 2016, you'll see that the consumer protection has been built up quite considerably, and it's trying to get this balance between protecting the consumer on the one side and allowing new business to grow, also from active consumers, but also at the same time to be fair to other players, to the incumbents. So, and this discussion has been going on, of course, for a long time. The Balancing Act has been going on for a long time, and I can understand that EDSO doesn't want to come to all of the events because I'm sure they're getting fatigued discussing the same issue round and round a little bit. But the regulator really does balance between, on the one hand, consumer protection really done very well now from GDPR. This is and it just puts the principle right smack dab globally on stage. Data is owned by whoever's data it is, and it is actually such a simple, but it's a mind-blowingly simple principle. But you have to enforce it, and this is very, very central also to everything that's being done in the regulation, and the directive. At the same time, you really do need to take into account the business side of it for all parties, and so. Last time we were together, we discussed the ownership of the smart meter. Yeah? Who should actually should the ownership of the smart meter be with EDSO, with the DSO, or should it be with the active consumer? If the active consumer is running a business, how could it be that he or she doesn't own the meter. However, on the other hand, if they have sole access to it, they could be cheating. So if you're in the business, you do need to be regulated. And this balancing act, you see the balancing act we're trying to find here, I think it's achieved quite well in the wording. Of course, if you write a law and the law has the balance right, implementation can turn things around and the way people use it can turn things around. But I think we're on a very good start, actually.
And you've brought us towards what I was thinking of asking next. So you alluded to the distinction there between household and business users, and Bertrand made the same distinction earlier. But let's think just about household users for a minute, because there are many different, and then we discussed this last time, we sat down to discuss this. There are many different kinds of household users. So you might have somebody who's lucky enough to live in a nice big house and he's miles away from his neighbours. You might have people living in houses all in a neat row. You might have people living in apartment blocks where the meters are all in a single place. I mean, and all of these different types of buildings. The idea of managing energy distribution between them is a different consideration, but so too is access and ownership of the meters. So I think my question is, how should policymakers, which could be, and when I say policymakers, I am partly talking about regulation, but I think I'm also just talking about policy too, the kind of the carrots as well as the sticks. How should policymakers account for that, and how should energy companies account for those distinctions if we want to get all these different types of users onto a functioning smart grid?
Yes, go on. I will be the last.
Right, it's a difficult question, but I think first you need to think about what are the principles that those people want to be ensure that the operator deliver, and I think safe, so cyber safe, right? Cyber security, so that I think it's something that is quite important. That we have a certification which ensures the cyber security of their connection to the grid. I think if you want to, from a business point of view, I think there is no one answer, right? You need to kind of build an architecture which is based on the different need of people. So I think when it comes to a purely technology approach, it's increasingly based on clouds. But you will have to associate both a cloud infrastructure and also, let's say a type of edge control, which means like something which is close to your asset, right? And so that in terms of the business approach, then I think there are some common principles again, coming back to the principle, like on free flow of data. It's quite important because we see that if you want to provide data analytics, it's very difficult to do it within one country only, right? And in terms of the incentive, there is something we allude to, but which is about sustainability, right? I think in the end of the day, you need to kind of also develop your tariff based also on the externalities, right, of the energy system, which is a discussion we haven't had for the moment, but it's, should it take the form of a carbon tax or a way to kind of really make sure that you have a right remuneration scheme for such products, which, deliver sustainability. That will be, I think, something which would help for sure, kind of addressing your question.
What I'd like to say here, you have described the different customers living in the different houses. I'd like to add something. All those customers living whatever kind of houses, they have mobile phones, they have cars, they have bank cards, and all of those will have the data policies. Yeah? So do you think that all the customers will follow 10, 15, 20, 100 different data policies? Or we rather say that there is a new sector has been born called the data, and most of the principles will be developed for the data sector and then tailor-made where it's necessary to the different sectors. In the short term, but I see that everybody started to, cultivate its own garden, own silo, own sector. But I do not see that it's happening. And I like to say that I've been invited, and I'm in the global board of the Research Data Alliance. And in the Research Data Alliance, we have 6,500 data scientists from very different domains, from geology to history, to linguistics, to plasma physics, to astronauts. And the astronauts are the best people to move the data management tools they learned to the linguist or to anyone else, because simply they needed to use the data management kind of tools first, because they are working with the big data and the plasma physics guys. Yeah. So what we recognize that you can be in whatever field of research domain, your data issues in 80% are absolutely the same. Yeah. So giving compare it to the smart meters and to the people used different sectors, I am absolutely sure that the same thing will happening. And what we developed in the Research Data Alliance, and maybe this is my added value here, that we agreed, these 6,500, to push for the global open standards that the people can use it in each corner of the world for each domain, as long it can be, horizontally the same, and then go to the last mile. Yeah, it's the same like you do with the highways. Yeah, the European Union is building the highways, and then the last mile is developed by the country. We do the same with the telephone network. Yeah, you develop the highways, and then you make the last mile with the very different ways to do. So I believe that the data management will be very much the same, that you will have the data management highways, and then you will have the tailor-made solutions. At the moment, it's not happening on that way, I have to say. Everyone is gardening in its own garden. And maybe because I collected data to share with you, that the Joint Research Center recently made the evaluation of the smart grid research projects. Just give you this number, which you are most interested. So 5 billion euro has been spent in the last 10 years in 950 projects. 950 projects, while half of the European member states did nothing. So at the moment, the sector is in the moment of divergence, but I can tell you, based on the Research Alliance, that there is a convergence, and it will be one data sector with the last mile for the sectors.
I can just, on the implicit in having players emerging, changing the way they operate, is that the regulator has to track this quite carefully. Again, I think colleagues in DG ENER have done very good. And if you look at the energy package upgrading rate of about 7 or 8 years every time, it's actually quite good. For a sector which is so conservative, such as energy, taking a new look at how the business is done is actually very good. The directive identifies the active consumer, it identifies aggregators, it identifies also local communities, which can be a legal entity which are working in the marketplace. And this really needs a regular review and to look at. But I think Edith is right that a lot of the basic principles will remain the same. They can be identified, we can come down on them, on the data. Also, the information necessity on things that market players can never control, tariff setting, taxes, levies, this world. It really needs to be, but actually the directive does that quite well. It puts the requirements to provide that data in a regular way on the member states. Whether or not they've done a CBA and they've actually liked to roll out smart meters and smart grids in a proactive way, actually it does it reasonably well, I think.
So there is something just I forgot to mention. You're right, Edith. I mean, interoperability is absolutely key, right? But I would be slightly more optimistic than you are, right? Because in the past, like the different systems, so your lighting system, your HVAC systems, they were completely disconnected, and two different proprietary systems. Now it is changing, and I think a lot of players are recognize that, they should move toward some degree of interoperability. But what is clear is that we'll never get like a meaningful smart energy sector if it's not based on open architecture, right? So it's super important, and that's the role of policymaker to make sure that this is the rule of the games for everyone.
If I may add something on this, I mean, in 2005 it was the famous CII directive for the ICT sector. I think that there are some people who remember that, yeah? And that time, the very big company Microsoft was fighting for against the open standards, yeah, the open codes. And I remember it because they put a big boat in the river in front of the Strasbourg building, and then the open source community could find a canoe. So they rented all the 100 canoes nearby, and then they surrounded the big boat of Microsoft. It was very symbolic in those days. And look, today is all about open source. So nobody can tell me that it will not be absolutely the same for data. It will and has to be open source because, if nothing else, because the efficiency and because the cost. Yeah, we cannot afford. Nobody in the world can afford to go for individual solution for everything. Simply cannot happen. And I agree with you that the legislation, yeah, the recast of the directive, is a very, very good one compared to other one. But still, it's a sectoral, and I see that it will melt it. And the last thing I like to say that I think that yes, the energy sector has one very big difference versus the data sector. That one is the very fast-moving sector. Yeah, it's extremely fast-moving sector, and the energy sector, due to the very high capital intensity, is a very low-moving sector. Yeah, you cannot turn. Yeah, you cannot turn because your capital investment is there. So it will not be a very and compare this. I think that what's happening in the energy sector is very, very promising. Being member of the ACER, I'd like to say, due to the directive, and this is my last sentence, that the directive asks more task for the ACER, the regulators, but I have to say that they can only do the job if they get the resources. And so far, whatever the legislation put on place to them as a task to do, it was never ever followed by the resources to make them able to do it. Yeah?
So I have one final. I'm just trying to kind of manage the time here because I'm anxious to open up to questions for the audience. I've got time, but I've got one final question that I'd like as quick an answer as possible on, because you pointed to the differences between the member states on this and the differences in member state action. Not everyone in the room will necessarily be familiar with the story of how the Energy Union came about and what have been the historical challenges for EU action in this space. So I'd just like to, perhaps Edith or Jānis could do this, to some, where the EU sits in deciding, and where the member states sit in deciding how data-driven smart grids are going to get rolled out, and what have been the challenges for EU action in this area over the last how many years?
Okay.
Yeah, you can go first. I can
and then top it off. Okay. I mean, smart grids have been in focus now for 10 years. Since, there was already a smart grid workforce when we started the renewables activity and the set plan and so on in 2006. And that has built into a considerable effort. There is the smart grid task force, which is stakeholders all across Europe, and they work on standards, they work on ways to roll out. They work, it's experts working on the how, mainly, on the how to do it. The member states have signed up to say that they will do, now, the basic principle within energy policy in Europe, member states have energy, I would call it sovereignty. Yeah. They decide what happens, what the mix is, how they manage things, what the tariff setting, how the tariff setting. I mean, this is why ACER has to always coordinate very, very closely. The European regulatory body has to coordinate very, very closely with its national members, because actually it's the national members who decide on the national tariffs. And so there's lots of national in this. So for the smart grid rollout specifically, studies done up to 2014. We have good data until 2014. Since then, it's a bit bitty, but we're going to take another look at that at 2020, when we're hoping to reach a much larger rollout. The aim is 200 million smart meters. Now, that if you think about that, that's 80% of everyone that's actually on the grid. That's a very, very large number. It's a very ambitious goal. Member states have to do their own cost-benefit analysis, the CBA, and on the basis of that, they decide we go ahead or we don't go ahead with a rollout program done by us. Sweden, Finland, and Italy are far ahead of the others. They already were in 2014, with 45 million smart meters already installed in 2014. And other member states most member states, I think there are 4 member states who haven't told us what they're doing. But all of the other member states, and maybe Hungary is one of those. I must check the list.
Actually, this is all in our report, State of Data Innovation in the EU lists the countries that have carried out the CBAs.
You can find the specific list, but certainly the front runners are well known: Sweden, Finland, and Italy. And so this is a process being under, and the CBAs are finishing just now. So actually, the member states, if you look at the 2014-2020 rollout period to try and reach the 200 million smart meters, you actually have, you've already lost about 2 years just doing your CBAs, in the cases of those countries who hadn't started by 2014. So it is a very ambitious. Probably we won't reach the 200 million, but we'll have those member states who are rolling out. I think it's 14 in total who are rolling. By the way, Germany is not one of those who is doing an extensive roll. For example, some of the big countries are not doing this. France is doing it, for example. So that rollout now has to happen very, very quickly, but there is expectancy that they will reach close to 100% smart meters in those countries. And that balances off a bit, so we'll get not too far from the final target.
I think that there is a revolution, the data revolution, and therefore there is a revolution in the electricity markets as well. And I don't think that the politicians can stop the revolutions. They normally cannot. So in my view, it will happen. Maybe some countries decide to go slow or decide to be to stop. There is nothing in the European treaty which says that the country has not a right to be stupid. Yeah, be honest. Yeah, so I think that it's allowed by the treaty to be the last one to do things which are not good for your citizens. And I know the country which actually exercises this in the single daily basis. But I think that there are 2 conditions which I'd like to mention here, why it will happen. And one of them will surprise you. Yeah? So one I already said, that will be not only the smart meter for electricity, but it will be a smart household. Yeah? For every resource the household using, it will be the smart household project. And it will be a good moment for me, because that was the mission I came in 2004 in. But there is an upstream, which is full of data. And yesterday I met the European Space Agency, and they made a presentation to a few people around the Space Agency and the energy. Yeah? And I don't know if you know, but today with the Earth observation data coming out from the Copernicus, you can actually see that where is the best place to put your windmill. Yeah? It's actually, with the Earth observation data, you can forecast from the snow in Norway that how many water you will have your hydropower. Yeah? And I can go on and on. You can look for the temperature of the Earth, and you will identify where are the best geothermal potential places to looking for. You can improve the rigging of the oil by 10% just to looking the magnetic storms from the sun, again by the different sentinels. So Europe, actually with the 7 billion investment put in place, the different sentinels, they provide a billion and billion megabytes of data each single day, which is just an untapped potential for the energy sector, any kind of sector, by the way, any kind of energy sources, including the nuclear. So I think it's just amazing. So you will have the downstream and you will have the upstream, and the grid is just the small bit in the middle with the smart meter. Yeah? So it will be all about data.
We're big fans of Copernicus at the centre.
Yeah, with the Copernicus in the centre.
So we've got a few minutes left. There isn't going to be a break after this panel. We're going to move straight on to the next panel. But with the few minutes left, I wanted to invite questions on this from the audience. Any questions on smart grids, smart meters? Yes, the gentleman at the back, sir. Could you please? There's a microphone in the left-hand arm of your chair. If you press the button, we'll all be able to hear you. You have it? Is there a cable?
It's okay. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, citizens. My name is Angelos Harlaftis, Epaphos Advisors. We represent here the EcoWaves movement, the Pan-European and Mediterranean movement, which is based in direct democracy, in science and in ecology.
I'm sorry, could you just speak a little slower?
Yes.
Thank you.
So there are questions also for the previous panel. which is very important as this one, because as we are promoting and we are telling to the institutions of the Union and to the citizens, we cannot have security for our data without this that Mr. Dennis Horgan expressed very well, the management of our system, which means what we propose, the European Internet, the CNET. In this way, this, which is in the future, will be the richness of any society, the data, we cannot control it. Whatever we are speaking, it's about regulations through the legislation, as it was correctly mentioned, but we cannot handle. Let's see the situation in USA with the president of Facebook. Immediately he was in front of the Congress, and when we call him here in Europe to explain us also the problems which are created from his handled management of our data, he's not responding directly. He needs time to think if he'll come or not. So this means that whatever we speak, it's only speeches, except if we take measures and invest 10 million euros, as we are telling, for the new protocols in order to create the CNET, and the user can switch to the internet if he wants. About the grids data, we have a long more time to think about it, because the smart meters, they are in a primitive level of technology. There are a lot of discussions about their let's say environmental impact inside the houses. Maybe that's why we have put it underground, because there are some studies which they say that they affect in various ways the health of the citizens which are living inside the house. So we need more studies about this. That's why it's not proceeding so fast, apart from the security. The security which we cannot be handled without our own internet. Thank you very much.
Any reactions from the panel to that point?
I can give you a very general reaction, which we discuss often in the RDA. And this is an ethical issue, but for Europe, it's a very, very serious issue to consider. I will reply more general than you think. All the European legislation is based on the famous precautionary principle. I think that all have you heard, yeah? So the precautionary principle that you are cautious, and therefore you try, and therefore you try, and then you move. This is true for pharma, this is true for everything we do in Europe. So the whole acquis communautaire is precautionary based. But the data is very much risk-based, yeah? This is a probability, yeah? So the data is a probability business, very much so. Yeah? And therefore, the clash of the risk-approached data which horizontally enter into each sector is a risk for the precautionary principle, where the trade-off has to be founded. You know, it will be something new, and it will not happen in one day, and it will not happen without the risk. But I'd like to reply you, and this is again more general than maybe you wish, and maybe it's strange from the politician. But just 100 years ago, or a bit more than 100 years ago, when the electricity has been developed, and then Tesla, the real Tesla, not Elon Musk, but the real Tesla person, developed the alternate current. Yeah? And the alternate current was a very new thing, and it was actually not very much in line with the business model of Mr. Edison in those days. So he said, there's absolutely the same thing like you do, make studies, make things, and he made everything to avoid the alternate current. He actually developed the electric chair to prove how dangerous the alternate current is. Imagine if, because the precaution, we would not go for alternate current. Yeah, then we would not discuss today the smart grid, yeah, and probably not the internet neither. So always there is the risk when there is the revolution, but you have to be carefully look and carefully move. And I think that this is the right approach to do. Move and stop and move and stop and think. But what we say in the RDA, that unless you do something, don't legislate. Because if you don't do, then you definitely do not know what is the legislation you have to put in place. So the knowledge has to come first, and the knowledge can come only on the evidence base by trying.
you know, I had never heard that Nikola Tesla invented the electric chair. What I had
No,
heard
no, no, it was Edison.
Edison, right, that was it. And that when it was being introduced as a system of execution in the United States, they were deciding which current to use for it, and there was lobbying on either side. So basically the industry representatives interested in direct current didn't want their system being used for executions, and those invested in AC didn't want their system being used for executions. It's this kind of, you know, saying please don't give us this business was the...
Happily not a European problem.
Happily not a European...
Yeah, but you see,
well, not today.
Yeah, but you see, anyway, it was a kind of pilot to show how dangerous the alternate current is. Yeah, and nobody wished to sit in the electric chair, I'm sure. Yes.
So, well, it might be good to instill that feeling in some of our audience members to wake them up. If you imagine your chairs are electric, any burning questions you'd like to ask of our panel in the last few minutes? No? Okay, well, we're actually bang on time for the next panel. So please give this panel a round of applause. Thank you very much.